let's get on to some drawing. Today, we are going to be covering the third class for another summer of drawing. And it's going to be kind of fun. We're going to do a little bit of stuff about actual techniques for texture, but it's going to be really sort of almost a practice session, because what I'm going to be talking about is how to sort of audition your ideas, audition your textures before you get into a big drawing. So it's sort of like a rough sketch, only you're taking it a little bit further. You are trying to actually draw the scene, not just sort of sketch it out. But you're going to be messing around with your pencils and seeing what works and what doesn't, with the idea that perhaps during this next week that you'll be doing what I'll be doing, which is the more finished drawing of today's topic, where I actually go ahead and use the stuff that worked. Okay, let's see. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. So, welcome to another Summer of Drawing class number 3. And this is on the theme of home. And this particular class is on nesting. Okay, so when we interpret, home, we think of also the comfort of home and the idea of nesting. And this is not in any way a new or particularly innovative take, but it is an opportunity to try drawing using some textures and seeing what our pencils will do, especially using the beveled end technique, in order to get some of those textures by changing how our strokes go. Now, I will say that for next week, I just want to make sure I mention this. We'll be doing some work on toned paper. So if you have any paper that's sort of a mid value, a gray, a blue, or anything like that, your pencils of any sort, and also it can be helpful to have a white charcoal pencil or a white colored pencil on hand, because we'll be using some of these techniques that we've been doing over the last couple of classes, but we'll also be moving into how to work with toned paper. In the meantime, today, what we're going to be doing is sort of finishing up this first look at how to use the beveled end of the pencils, with the idea that instead of blending with a smudge tool or something like that, or your finger, and it's really hard for me not to do that. It's something I usually do when I draw, that we're instead relying on the pencil stroke, the width of the beveled end of the lead, and just the value of the pencils instead. So what we're going to work on today is that we're going to use this lovely little bird and this nest, because this picture has a lot of different textures in it. We've got the metal, we've got the nest, we have the feathers and different types of feathers. We have this looks like silicone or some kind of stucco going around the side of this box. And then we have the brick background. So part of what we have to do is decide, what we're going to do with each one of these textures. Not only how much do we want to have in the drawing, how much of this particular photograph are we going to use? And we're only going to use one photo this week, not trying to put two together. But it is a chance to say, well, when we draw, we've got a lot of similar values. If you squint at this right now, we have some darks, but we do have a lot of these midtones. And if we were to just draw everything with the same pencil stroke, it would probably look a little bit dull. We want to figure out how to add some pizzazz by going through the process of adding texture and using the strokes to actually help with that. So I'm always talking about observation. And when you get to the point where you're not just sort of sketching really quickly because you're trying to get an impression down in your notebook, and you're actually considering how to do a better and more complete drawing, it is so worth it to take a few minutes to just really look at the subject matter that you're dealing with, especially when you have a perfect little photograph like this, and try to figure out, where are you going to start? So this is before you even start sketching, before you put pencil to paper. So the first thing that I like to do is I always look for those darks. I find that those are sort of the things that anchor the drawing. It's one of the reasons I like to also start with a notan. So in this particular case, if you squint at this picture right now, some things that will jump out at you. Of course, the bird, his head and back and his tail. The areas between the bricks are dark. Around the box at the back where that silicone or whatever it is peeling away. The interior of the box is dark. And then between the nest grasses, you can sort of see some shading there and a sense of form to the nest itself, as well as the depths in between the grass. And then there comes the question of the background. And so I put a question mark beside it because although obviously those values are dark, one has to think about, is that going to actually compete with the stuff that's the subject matter? Likewise, the top, darkness of bricks there, is that going to help or hinder the drawing overall? And what happens is when you get to this point and you're starting to ask yourself these questions, this is when it becomes really useful to audition your idea by doing a reasonably complete drawing, but not worrying about it too much. You can erase very easily things like that background and see what happens. So the next thing to look for are the light values, the lightest stuff. So we've looked for the darkest, now we're looking for the lightest. So if we squint again, okay, some stuff pops right out. The box to the right of the nest is obviously light. There are some highlight rims going around the edge of the metal. Those will help to give some a sense of depth and a little bit of proportion to the box itself, for example. You've also got the nest grasses themselves. They have a lot of lightness where the light is hitting them. So that is going to be needed to help add some form. And then, of course, you've got, very small areas of light on the bird's head where there are white feathers, a little bit to the tail and that sort of thing. So by identifying the lightest areas and the darkest areas, well, that leaves everything else as a middle value of some sort, gives you a starting point. So an audition is not a completed drawing where you're taking it to the full extent, but it's a chance to try out how your sketch might look based on how you do the actual strokes, because each one of us is different. How we do quick strokes, how we do fast strokes, and all of that sort of thing is very much a matter that's personal, like our own personal handwriting. What you end up with is probably going to look different from mine. So I wanted to show you, though, the notan that I did start with, because I started with a lot more dark in, but as I did my little audition, I made some changes as I went along. This is exactly why this stage is so useful before you do a complete drawing. Sometimes the notan is exactly where you want to go, and sometimes it isn't. So what I'm going to do right now is show you, I want you to do some warm-up practice right now on this business of doing strokes. I'm going to show you a little video where I do it. You can draw along, and then I'll show you the finished image again so you can keep going. But what you're looking for is to just practice a little bit with your pencils that you have on hand right now, varying the pencil strokes. So this is really, really important to doing a beautiful drawing and actually to doing a beautiful painting and all sorts of things, is not relying, and we all do it, we pick up that one pencil and then we try to do the entire drawing with it because we get into the flow and we forget that we have all of these other tools that we could be using. So what I try to do is keep a little piece of paper where I've done this practice, perhaps before I start a big drawing. And I have all of these different strokes. And it reminds me every now and again when I see that sitting to the side of me, not only can I try out new strokes on it or make sure the bevel of my pencil is at the right angle or whatever I need, but it also reminds me change it up, vary those strokes. Wide, narrow, light, dark, medium, long, short, etc. So I'm going to just play this little video and you can see. The other thing that's useful in this is, I don't know why I've got two videos, that's interesting. Okay, the other thing that's really useful is sometimes when you're working with a particular pencil that is beveled at the end, you can use it for more types of strokes. You can, turn it a little bit to a side, put it up to the tip. And sometimes it takes a little while to figure out exactly how to do that with any kind of control. Of course, we can still do, the washes, the graphite washes that we've been doing up until now. Another thing is to try just lifting that pencil, doing long strokes that lift up, do short strokes that lift up, vary the speed because you'll get a different amount of a deposit of graphite. And so just while this video is playing, just play around with your own pencils a little bit just to get an idea of what they might do. Now, this business of doing a quick stroke and lifting off is a really valuable stroke. There are often times where if you've got the pointed end of an object, or say you're doing these grasses in the nest, and you want to actually just have this kind of tailing off end without drawing it out with a smaller pencil. Being able to just do that with one stroke is extremely valuable. So here I am trying it with different pencil leads. And this is just a good thing for a warm up. It also reminds you whether you've actually managed to keep that bevel on your pencil or not, whether you need to, resharpen mine, which I had to do while I was doing this. Another thing that's useful is to have strokes that follow the contour of something, follow the edge, try to help give form by actually not just shading, but actually have the strokes themselves move around. And another thing that you can do with a beveled pencil lead, which takes some practice, is to actually tip it up more towards the point and then back towards the flat part as you're drawing. So all of this, these are just things to practice. Like everything else, the more you draw this way, the faster you'll be. But what I find is really useful, and why I'm so keen on starting off this summer by teaching you how to use these beveled ends of pencils, is because it's fast once you get the hang of this. What will happen is things like these auditions will go by pretty quickly because you'll be able to get those larger masses in, get a feel of how your textures might look, and then decide how much of the beveled pencil you want to bring into your drawing as you go about the larger piece, and how much you'd like to do with a smaller or more narrow tip. So I think I'm just finishing up here using a relatively hard pencil, which gives quite different results. Once again, I'm just sort of dragging with the side of it to see, what that does. In this particular case, with a hard pencil, this is a 2H I'm using, I get quite a different darkness, quite a different value if I'm just using sort of the point of the pencil rather than using the flatter edge. I think I do a couple more things here. So, oh yeah. So this is once again, talking about grass, feathers, small objects that have some fluff to them. This idea of quick, fast liftoff with your pencil lead from the paper is really helpful. Sometimes where you hold the pencil is different. You might have noticed I just shifted where I was holding my pencil a little bit further back because this is not a beveled end. This is just a regular end of a pencil, and I was getting too dark. So in order to vary the pressure, I found it helpful to hold it a little bit further back. And in this case, just hatching in various different directions. Sometimes there are small textures, whether it's sort of a tweedy look to something, a mossy look, something where there are small fibers. All of that is really helpful to use small strokes. And sometimes there are situations where you've got an actual defined edge to something for whatever reason, and you want to be able to bring your strokes up to the edge, but not further. All of this kind of stuff is just a good way to practice. And then, of course, very light, very feathery touches are good for, for stuff that's fluffy, for fur. And once you get the hang of this, you'll be able to sort of draw in contour or kind of around an object so that when you need highlights or to add a little bit more hatching in, you can use the same pencil in this case, but build up some layers to get a little bit of a contour. So these are just some approaches to the whole idea of, well, let me get to the next, there we go, to the whole idea of texture. And now I'm going to tell you something that you probably don't want to hear, and that is that there really isn't one way to do a texture for any one thing. So we're going to work on today on a drawing that has lots of different textures, but each one of us will interpret it a different way. Obviously, I'm going to show you kind of how I go about it, but you might find that something completely different is more appealing to you. So as we go forth, just keep thinking about this business of practicing texture. While we do this piece today, it doesn't matter how this bird turns out or how the bricks turn out or how the nest turns out. I'm more concerned that you get in the habit of doing different types of strokes in different types of places. All right, so let's start though with things that we know, and we know about the no tan. So when I was starting this, before I got any of these ideas in my head about how I was going to proceed. I said, all right, I want to start with what I know, which is what are the dark and light patterns? Because no matter the type of drawing that's going to go on, we need the notan. So if you want to go ahead and take a few minutes, I'm just going to explain why I've got two here. You can start drawing your own version. Don't forget, squint at this thing and have a look. So what I did to begin with was I was like, oh, I don't really actually know where to start. I don't really know where the darks are because I see some stuff in the bricks in particular. Are they dark? Are they not? Do I want them in the drawing? So what I did was I did the thing I'm always telling you guys to do, which is start with what you see. Start with what's the easiest. So the easiest stuff for me to see that was dark was the head and the back of the bird and the tail, and then the inside of the box, and then also there were some obvious dark areas in this image. So I was like, okay, great. I've started that. Then what do I see? And so the second notan, the larger one at the bottom, was where I went to next. I added in some darks under the nest. I was like, okay, that's good. I added in, I said, okay, let's do the darks that are on the right-hand side in the brick. That would work because I can bring that down to the corner. That's nicely balanced, but I need to tie it in now to the bottom of the nest. So I added darks where darks aren't, which is perfectly fine to do. I just felt I needed some darks down there. And then I said, okay, now I finally got to address this problem of the background on the left-hand side. Why don't I just put a little bit of darkness down near the bottom left-hand corner, because that'll help pop out the lightness on the box. And I'll leave it at that for the moment and see what happens. So that's basically what I ended up doing, just to give me a starting point. Now, in my audition sketch, I ended up making a bunch of changes. And I haven't yet decided for my final drawing, which I'll show you next week, because I think it'll be so much fun to do this. I haven't quite decided which way I'm going to go yet. I've still got some things to work out. And I think it's really valuable for me to tell you about that, because I don't want you to think, oh gosh, Elizabeth's been doing this for a long time and she knows this solution all the time. And, these things that she shows in class are, because it always works out in a very clear order. It actually doesn't. There is a circuitous path to some drawings and a very direct one to others. But my view is that what I'm aiming for is excellence. And by excellence, I don't mean perfection. I mean, I'm trying to do the best drawing I can for a particular subject to the extent that I want to go. Now, you've seen over the last couple of classes, sometimes I want to, do a major drawing, and sometimes I'm just fine with what happens in an hour. But for you, for your own personal idea of what that level of excellence is, sometimes it takes going through these different iterations to figure it out. So let's move on from the notan. All right, so I just wanted to show you a little bit of a closer view of the bird, which I think is a robin, and also the notan I ended up with. I also considered the concept of home. I really, the larger photo I started from, which I didn't show you, has a lot more background in it, and I decided to key right in on this part right here, this idea of home, this little guy in his nest or her nest. And also making sure it's a balanced composition. So what I did today, for you to do today, is this particular little, relatively quick, still took me an hour to do, because there's a lot of a thought pattern that went on, but it helped me decide how I was going to make the metal look different from the nest. How was I going to worry about the feathers on the bird? And what was I actually going to do about the brick in the background? Now, I haven't really solved the brick in the background yet, but I do feel that the nest, the metal, and the bird are under control. And this is sort of the way that you kind of get into a drawing. Not everything is always decided up front, but let's get started, because I want to take you through the same process. So just to start off with, take a few minutes just to sketch out, and I'm going to show you the reference image in a minute, using a light pencil, the main lines of the scene, starting with the focal point. So I have a nasty habit of always wanting to start on the left-hand side of my reference and work my way in. And if I'm not careful, that means my actual focal point is not on the page where it's supposed to be. So I have found starting with the focal point, putting that where I actually want it on the page, and then working in whatever else I work in is a more successful way to go. So go ahead using this reference and do that. Go ahead and just like mark out where everything is. And I want to talk a little bit while you're drawing. I'm just going to keep track of the time here. While you're drawing, I want to talk a little bit about perspective. So I know texture is sort of the main focus of today's class, but there are a couple of really tricky things about this particular reference material that you're going to encounter the minute you start drawing this box. First, our eye level is not at the eye level of the robin. We are actually above, a little bit above probably about the middle of the bricks that we can't see above this reference image. And the way we can tell that is because all of the lines that we see, the lines of the brick, the perspective lines of the box, are all heading upwards, but none of them have reached parallel. None are exactly horizontal. So everything is sort of going up towards the horizon line, but that tells us that our horizon line or our eye level is a little bit above. That means we have to be really to pay attention to where those angles are, because as they go down, in other words, the open lip of the box, they'll become more acute and they'll become flatter as they come up towards our eye level. Now, when you draw something like this open box with kind of an odd angle to the top edge of the open part, that is the sort of angle that's so easy to get wrong. Likewise, if that lid were to shut, that leading edge that's quite bright, we sort of see a highlight on it. That's another angle that's difficult to get because our brain is always trying to think about what is inside the box. And so it gives us more of an isometric view in our head of how this box, how wide it must be, how it must be placed in order for that top to come down. And we have to instead, and I do it by squinting. I squint at the box and I see how narrow that opening really looks if I want to draw it. Like we know it's probably, 4 or 5 inches wide. But when we look at it and squint, we see it's actually this sort of narrow strip. Likewise, I always hold my pencil up, double check that angle of that opening, and then holding my pencil still, I bring it back over to my sketch pad and look. Because depending on how you're holding your sketch pad, that sometimes changes how the perspective looks, and just what our mind is thinking about what is going on. Now, I will tell you some of the details from this image I didn't include in my audition, like the little screws and that kind of thing. That sort of stuff I would add in it for a final version if I thought it was necessary. But right now, I'm just sort of trying to figure out what the scene looks like. So keep working on this. And I'm going to move us on actually to the next stage because these are the stages that take a little bit longer. So what I did next, once again, remembering that this is not the final version, this is the audition version, I started working in some of my lighter values and also cleaning up lines as I went, trying to figure out, okay, I am going to need a little bit of that rim light on the edge of the box top. I am going to need, some highlights here and there. And it doesn't look like it here, but I was doing this in a 2H pencil. So this is super light on my page. I've darkened it quite a bit just so that you can see what's going on. But at this point, I'm going, all right, I've got to start thinking about how are these textures going to work and how am I going to show them? So on the metal, for example, I was like, okay, I can do these long vertical lines. And even if I don't mass them all together and make sort of like a sheet, I kind of like these directional lines using the 2H. They give me an idea that this is a different kind of surface than the nest. And for the nest, because this was in a very light pencil, I just started following the form of the nest around. Behind the nest, I went a little bit darker with the next darker pencil, I think just an H. And I said, okay, well, that I liked that way those lines looked going up and down. It's the same type of of surface. It's another metal surface. So I'm going to do the same thing along the back there. Now, then I got to the brick. And I'm like, oh, I don't know what to do with the brick yet. And so I started working instead on that silicone that went around the edge of the box. And then I was like, okay, I can't ignore the brick. I've got to do something with that. So as you're now working on this, you'll start to sort of see kind of, where I made a few decisions. I was like, I've got to do something about the brickiness of the bricks. How am I going to actually make that happen? And to dive in, because I was being kind of sketchy and I knew this was an audition, I said, well, I'm not going to worry about the darkness of the shadow right now. That's an easy enough problem to solve. But what I do have to think about is perhaps how am I going to deal with the roughness underneath the bricks and the edge on the top. So go ahead and spend a few minutes working on this. There is a lot of decision making that goes on, perhaps more than people realize when they haven't done this sort of thing. And every decision doesn't work out perfectly from the start. For example, by the time I got to the end of this, I could see that I was going to really have to rethink how I was going to handle the bricks in the background, because there was the possibility that they would overshadow the bird itself. Now, in this photo, of course, this photographer blurred the background. So that made it really easy. They used a lens that just sort of concentrated on the foreground and let the background blur out. And a way that artists often with pencil often do smudging or something like that for a similar effect. That is definitely a perfectly valid way to approach this. But in this particular case, I wanted to keep concentrating on this idea of using the beveled pencil and how is that going to work. So I am going to move us on to the next stage, even though I haven't given you a lot of time right here, just because I know you can keep drawing at this, but I want to show you what comes next. So when we get to step 3 on all these drawings, this is when I start having a lot more fun because I start to see what's going on. So I started at this point working in the masses in the middle values using the HB or B pencils. And I used the areas where the mid and the light values met to define edges rather than using the outline. So I'm still keeping it sketchy, but I'm having a look at, how is the dark stuff going to work? So I'm just going to go back to the previous stage because I know a lot of you are still working on this, but you can I wanted you to see where I was going to go next on this. Once again, trying to figure out, making sure that perspective is right to start off with, just because it's always good practice, even when you're just sketching something like this, to make sure that you've got that part under control. And while we're actually on this particular stage, I'd like to talk just a little bit about drawing nature. Now, I know this week I said it was going to be still life, so I figured this little girl is pretty still, and it counts as a still life. But when it comes to drawing things in nature, and there's a book that I love that I'm always talking about. I've got it sitting here, The Law's Guide to Nature Drawing and Journaling. When you look at a book like that, it often shows these ways to draw a bird, for example, that have, here's a large circle, here's a small circle, a triangle for the tail, and to use that as the starting point. And I think it's an interesting and valid way to draw things like birds and animals, particularly if you're out there sketching in nature and you're really quickly trying to get the proportions of a bird that you see, and you start from those big shapes. That's really great. But one of the reasons I never, ever start you guys off with that sort of thing is because I really want you to observe the shapes. In this case, we've got this very triangular shape of the bird. You've got, sort of an elongated parallelogram going on with the tail. It doesn't start off from a triangle, and the head doesn't start off from a circle. But that is a really useful way when you are sketching to really quickly kind of get your form right, I really think it works best showing working from observation first. So let's move on and look at this darker version again for a second. So one of the things that you can see here is that I'm starting to think about using those short strokes, using some masked in areas, but I'm following the contour. You can see, for example, under the neck on the bird, round the eye, and around the back, the bars of the feathers. Also, what am I going to do about the tail? How is that exactly going to work? And how am I going to get that sketchiness that's needed for the nest, the lights and darks in? Now, I'm already planning in my head at this point that when I do a more finished drawing, I will be a lot more careful, of course, about where those lights and darks go. But I want this kind of random feel. I want to have it a little bit on the messy side, just like a nest really does, because I want it to contrast quite a bit with what's going on the box. At this point, I've also decided, well, what happens if I do a little cross hatching on the box? Do I like that? Over on the left-hand side, you can see pretty clearly that I looked at that dark area that happens as the box turns away from the light and how it has a highlight after it, and said, here's a good place for some of those short strokes using the beveled edge, and then I'm going to erase out the lines at the end. So I'm going to move on to where you can see the reference and continue yourself doing the same thing. So this is really, auditioning is really all about exploration and trying to see, what happens when you do this? What happens when, with your pencils that you have, like, are yours darker than mine or lighter than mine? You know, are you able to achieve a short, quick stroke like that? Or perhaps you have a very interesting curved stroke that works really well for defining the nest. Now, one thing I'd like to point out, and you might have seen it already from what I'm doing, I'm trying to leave the highlights of the grasses in the nest light without outlining them. I'm trying to use the pencil just to show the shapes of the darks. Now I'm doing it roughly because, like I said, this is just an audition. I'm just trying out how these strokes work, what is going to work here. But what I am doing is I'm not going through and drawing every single little edge of every single grass and then kind of filling in the area. Now you absolutely 100% can draw like that. There's nothing wrong with it. This sketch that I'm doing right now is probably about 7 inches by 7 inches. It's not very tall, especially when you're using some of those wider and darker leads. You definitely get to the point where you really can't do those tiny little details. But the quickness and the sharpness and sort of the messiness of the grass was really what I wanted to bring in. I also did a few of these trailing grasses down the side where I used both the bevel and then up on the edge of the pencil and then the bevel again, just as I showed you earlier on, just to get a few, directional lines in there that were a little bit different. Oh, I see Anna's put up the information about that nature journaling book. We're both fans. We're both fans of that author and his books. He has quite a bit out there. If you like drawing nature, certainly his books have a lot to say. You'll see where sometimes our methods meet and sometimes they're different because he is specifically talking about nature journaling, whereas I'm talking about sort of sketching to get to a more finished drawing. So the other thing that at this particular stage, when you're using these, HB or B pencils, you haven't got to the real darks yet, is you've got to make some decisions about the other colors. And by other colors in this particular case, I mean this russet, this orangish color on the breast. It's not a light, it's not a dark, it's somewhere in between, and somehow that'll have to get addressed. Now, when I do a larger version, I'll probably end up using, maybe like an H for the lighter areas of the orange, and then probably nothing darker than an HB to denote the very, very smaller, softer feathers. And you can even see from my sketch how I didn't try to delineate those lines quite as much as I did the dark bits on the back or around the face, because that has to be a lot more subtle. We're really not talking about, a stripe underneath to the bird. So as I was doing this, as I was working on this audition, I was thinking through my head, well, how am I going to do this? I want a lot of attention on the head. I want that to be the darkest area with the most detail. And then I think the back, the tail, and the nest need to be the next areas of interest. The box itself that this nest is sitting on it's not, it's important because, of course, it's holding the nest, but it isn't as important. And likewise, the bricks, how important are the bricks? So I was just sort of really quickly sketching in what the bricks might look like. I added in the dark area where the shadow was. And I just wasn't really all that thrilled with how it was coming along. I'm like, okay, this is an area that will have to get worked out separately. Maybe I keep the brick texture, but get rid of that shadow line. I haven't quite decided. So I like to have an opportunity to think about these sorts of things. So I will do an audition like this, and I'll just leave it sitting around on a table for, as long as I feel like, a few days, or it could be even months. And I might come back to it at some point, just pick up the eraser, erase something that didn't work, and try something completely different. Once you do a drawing, even if you really like it, it's not carved in stone. Now, sometimes you do erase something that you really did like, and you wish to goodness you could get back to it. There's no Control Z, unfortunately, when it comes to doing drawing. But if something bugs you, and for me, it's that line, that shadow line in the bricks bugs me. I've got to figure that out. So it'll be interesting when we get to next week to figure out what I ended up doing with it, because right now it isn't sorted. All right, I am going to move on to the next stage, knowing that you're still drawing on this and that we have a bunch of time, because I do want to give you a good amount of time at the end here. All right, so this is where I got to on my audition. And I just wanted to show you kind of what my finished state was. I took a soft pencil. I used a 4B in this particular case. And I went back to that reference material again. And I said, all right, I need to make sure my focal area and the things that I want to have dark are dark. Now, this is varying to a great extent from my NOTAN in terms of not having those other dark areas. And what I will probably do at some point between the end of this and before I start a final drawing, is I might even take a piece of tracing paper and put it over the top of this audition sketch and quickly draw in, what if I did make all of that dark? Now, I don't really feel like doing it on this sketch, because although I've just told you about erasing and that kind of thing, I like what's happening. I like, kind of how the business to the right on the box is working underneath the nest. I like how that's working. I don't really want to mess that up. So a piece of tracing paper over the top does the same thing. So let's move on to showing you my final version and the sketch so that you can keep working on it a bit. So I'm imagining by now you can really see the value of doing this kind of thing, where you've had a look at your reference, you really like the reference, you really want to draw something like this, and you're trying to figure out, what's going to happen. So when I do something like this, another thing that I take into account, even though I did that NOTAN up front that established my light and dark areas, and even though I've now veered away from that for this particular drawing, I might even consider, well, what happens if I just crop that and don't have the background in? Or what happens if I go back to having more background in? Does that help? Do I actually need a bit more texture back there? Or do I like that shape? Now, I'm particularly drawn to how that shape of the head and the beak looks without something behind it. So I'm pretty sure I'm going to end up, working in that area. But this is a good time to, when I say about asking yourself questions, these are the sorts of things, not like not like the kind of questions like, what is life? But how am I actually going to solve, and have I thought through all the various options? This is also a really good time to note the fact that you've got that practice piece that you did early on sitting beside you, and ask yourself, am I using enough different pencil strokes in here? So, one of the things that occurred to me after I had completed this, of course, and put the whole class together, was that I could have done those bricks possibly by doing a very light tone, like the 2H, all over it, and then just using little kind of almost stippling marks to do the texture rather than lines, because that way the lines would look different from the nest and they would look different from the feathers. And that's something I'm probably going to try, on a side piece of paper and see if that works. Another thing that's really useful at this point is to figure out how to bring the eraser back in. So one thing I did right before I stopped and put this into the lesson was I went through and picked out a few of the highlights in the nest with one of the erasers, and I was like, oh, that works kind of nicely. I can't overdo that because I want to keep that sense of form, but it does allow me to sort of pull my eraser through some of the areas I've masked in and get some of that light back again. So this is all part and parcel of doing a drawing. And when you're getting to the point where you're moving from just doing sketches and you're actually trying to get to the point where you'd like to do something more finished, these stages of thinking it through are really useful. Now, what I have is I've got a number of drawings in different stages. I've got a number of paintings in different stages, because I think the time to step away and have a look at it, maybe from a distance or as you're walking by a table or whatever, is super valuable to deciding how you're going to go about things, from this point onwards. And while we're here, I'd like to talk about something completely different, a la Monty Python. But this is a good time for me to tell you that I've just opened up the call for the Martha's Vineyard Drawing Prize for this year. Now, the Martha's Vineyard Drawing Prize is a competition, a drawing competition I started about 4 years ago. And I'm not telling you this because I'm pushing you to enter, but you'll find a particular point about this year's competition to be really interesting. I'm using the same theme for the competition this year, which is home. And the competition winds up about the same time our classes do. I think the deadline is the 12th of September. And so that means all of these artists are going to be, submitting all their work. Last year, I think we had 400 different entries from around United States and Canada. Last year's theme was different. It was the theme of questions. And this year it's home. And on the 17th is when we'll announce who the winners are. And I put the finalists and winners up on the website, mvdrawingprize.com. And there's also an Instagram and that sort of thing. And I'll send this information around for you with the PDF after this class. And the reason I mention all of this is because I think it would be really instructive at the end of our classes this year to have a look at what all of these other artists, how did they interpret home? Because they are making finished drawings. They are taking drawings, some of them are large, some of them use silver point, some of them are in color, some are in charcoal, some are in graphite, and just to see how other artists interpret that same theme. It'll be really interesting. And then I leave all of that stuff up on the website for the next year. So you'll be able to go back and have a look at it. And by all means, if you feel like entering something, go ahead. I certainly wouldn't want to stop you. But this isn't to pressure you in any way. It's just to tell you that there'll be this other opportunity to see how other artists do that sort of thing. So if you go to that website now, you'll see the finalists from last year. And likewise, there's an Instagram. It's at MV Drawing Prize. And then there's also at MV Drawing Prize _showcase. And I'll send those around as well. And the showcase actually is all of the artwork, or almost all of the artwork, that was submitted over the last few years. I haven't put actually everything from last year up there. I'm going to continue to post more work all the way up to the deadline of this year's competition. So if you follow those Instagram accounts, you'll start to see a lot of just very different approaches to drawing. I mean, they're really, each one of us, we produce drawings in so many different ways. And that's why I think something like this, doing these little auditions for sketches, going through these processes, practicing your strokes, I hope that you will gain the confidence, and particularly after seeing all the different ways that people draw, not to think that your own way of drawing is somehow not up to par, that there's a way to do any of this, because there isn't. There are so many different ways to approach it. And all that really matters is that you start to get enough practice and confidence through doing all of these iterations that you start to feel that you might actually have an idea that you feel confident about that you can take to the next step. And this is why I don't want to always rush you straight from the notan right into a finished drawing and have that stress. I like to be able to every now and again take you through an audition of, especially of something that's a little bit complicated, to try everything out. All right, I'm going to give you just a couple more minutes on this, and then we're going to go ahead and wrap this up, because I have a few things that I want to actually show you screen sharing at the end. The more I look at this reference image, the more intrigued I am with that nest. They're just works of art, aren't they? Really fantastic. Okay, let me move us along then. All right, so I hope you got a good sense from doing that how one goes about just sort of really testing out how you're going to approach a larger drawing. And I'll be sending, of course, all of this information around in the PDF after class, as I normally do. If you are just joining the classes, everybody who's registered for the Zoom, I email the PDF with everything from the class in it to you afterwards. And if anybody is watching on a video later, you can go to my website, elizabethwhelan.com, to the art classes page, and all of the PDFs and the reference images are available there for download. Because I think it's really important to have this stuff around so you can refer to it. Maybe a year from now, you want a bit of a reminder. So when we're talking about any type of drawing and following a concept, of course, we're talking about telling our own story. Well, I've never been a bird in a nest, but I've always loved birds and nests. And I think the artistry of the nest itself is really important. So when we say, brainstorm to get beyond formulaic responses, and, that puts a lot of pressure on you to come up with something, really new and different. But sometimes a familiar interpretation is just fine. Sometimes just drawing flowers is just fine, or whatever it happens to be, the bird in the nest. What is important is how we put our own personal spin on it. So this is why I'm really keen that when we do start with a notan. We do start with some kind of idea or concept, in this case, home. So it's not, for us today, we weren't drawing a bird in a nest in a scene. We're drawing this sort of, home-like little vignette almost of this little bird, protecting perhaps eggs or whatever she was doing. So use as many iterations as you want to, whether it's a thumbnail, notan, rough sketch, or what I call an audition, which is actually a more highfalutin version of a rough sketch before you go to a complete sketch or drawing. I just think it's really important to be able to be willing to have a drawing perhaps take you actually months to complete from idea all the way to the end, because the work will improve through that seeking of excellence for yourself. And I do delineate between excellence and perfection. We're not after the perfect drawing, but you are after going, okay, I need to maybe challenge myself a little on something and maybe come up with a better idea. So for me, excellence for next week, and we're going to see if I manage it or not, we'll be figuring out what to do about those darn bricks. I just can't quite solve that yet. And I'm going to have to sketch out a few different versions, try a few different ideas with texture, maybe a little bit of stippling sort of stuff with my pencil, maybe not, maybe doing something lighter, maybe adding that dark in around the edges will distract a little bit from the darkness of the bricks. I've got to try different things. I really want you to see that I go through all of these stages as well. And my artwork is better because of it, because I don't just go, okay, I'm just doing this one thing and everybody needs to do exactly the same. So for technique, we also want to do that business of observation, not just the practice business, but also the observation. If you're working with textures, you can actually identify how many textures am I going to be dealing with. I'm going to be dealing with feathers. I'm going to be dealing with the beak. I'm going to be dealing with the nest, the box, the bricks, the silicone, whatever it happens to be. Because then you've got to go, which pencils? I only have this set of pencils. Which ones am I going to use? Which strokes would work? Which ways can I add other things in? Now, by the end of the summer, I'll have shown you some other pencil techniques so that you would feel free to approach a subject like this using mixing them all together. Right now, I've got you pretty keyed in on this idea of the beveled edges plus a little bit of extra. And that's really how I'd like you, when you work on your own time this week, to finish a more complete drawing of this robin. I'd like you to sort of stick to that. In the future, the sky's the limit, and you'll be able to draw on this larger, array of tools to get there. But thinking it through, not just automatically starting and doing the same old thing you've always done. What you'll start to notice when you see drawings out there is how many artists don't add variety into their drawings or into their paintings. They do use the same stroke through the whole thing. And I'm going to try to encourage you to not do that and add variety. So get those first layers down with the beveled pencil leads, working from light to dark. Come back into the sketch as you need it with sharper pencils, lighter or darker pencils. This is for your final version. Vary those strokes and think about what you're drawing while you're drawing it. Really, if there was a secret to drawing textures, this is it. In your mind, be thinking about that texture, what that texture looks like, what it feels like, and your brain will start to give you helpful information to send to your hand about the types of strokes, about how those various different strokes, widths, dark, light, short, long, slow, fast, how those will contribute, because you're feeling the feeling of the grasses in the nest. You're feeling the smoothness of the metal, and you're feeling the idea of the texture of the bricks, I hope. We're going to find out. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute because I want to show you a couple of books. Okay, we're back in the studio. I hope that was a good way to get started, and I hope you'll have some time this week to actually try drawing this robin again based on what you've just done. And the books I want to show you, some of them I've shown you before if you have seen any of my videos, but I just want to bring them up again because we're sort of wrapping up this part with the beveled pencil leads today. We're going to move on to toned paper next week. And there are a couple of books that I found really useful when it came to using this technique. This one is called A Better Approach to Pencil Drawing by Frank Rines. Now, this first came out in, I think it was 1935. Yes. And then was republished in 1940. So it's actually out in a couple of different, I think a couple of different formats. But so this is like 90 something years ago, which is a little bit scary to realize. But Frank Rines did a bunch of books about drawing, and he was very keen on this particular technique. And as I show you a couple of, for example, he has a page in here where he goes through numerous different textures, for example, using the lighter and the darker pencils and combinations, just really kind of warm-ups to get you used to doing that sort of thing. And then his approach overall to sketching in this manner uses, as you'll see, kind of these washes of graphite and directional strokes. I'm going to get in really close so you can see this one right here. And this is all the sorts of things that we've been talking about today. And it's a way to get quite quickly to an end result. For example, those bricks and those windows are done using beveled sketches, beveled pencils. And even though the subject matter in the books, it's perhaps a little old fashioned. I do love these cows. I love showing these cows here. But there's a lot of benefit to be had from having a book like this, which is quite inexpensive, and copying some of the pictures in it just to get your idea down. Because on one hand, I'm very keen on you trying your own thing, on all of these different things, on the houseboat, on the igloo, today on the robin in the nest. But if you feel you need a bit more control over how using the beveled leads work, I highly recommend just maybe borrowing this book from the library, and if you can get a copy, and just giving it a shot, just seeing if you can copy his particular strokes. It's a different and very much more controlled way of drawing than I do, but I think it's really instructive. And then the other book, which actually takes this a lot more in depth, is this one by Arthur Guptill called Rendering in Pencil. Now, Arthur Guptill was putting books out about the same time, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and they are much more in depth. This particular one, Rendering in Pencil, goes a lot into architectural drawing and how to use those same types of techniques for drawing buildings and such. And I wanted to point that out because if anybody is doing a lot of drawings of buildings or has buildings incorporated in their drawings and is finding it difficult to do those, borrowing that book from the library and just copying a few of the drawings. You don't have to, copy the whole book, but just to get an idea of how someone like Arthur Guptill approached it. Because he was I'll just sort of try to find a page here. He was very methodical about his way of going about sketching like this. Here's a good example. But it's, it uses all of these same techniques that we've been talking about. You can see right there the beveled strokes. Some of them are pretty sketchy in this example. And then he's got some stuff in here, which is really, just really gorgeous sort of finished artwork using those same techniques. All he's using is graphite. All he's doing is varying the pencil value, varying the type of, whether it was beveled or pointed pencil he was using. There's some great stuff in here on trees. I know that trees is a subject that we'll be addressing this summer, but is one that people ask about all the time. So, I've got my way of showing you how to get into drawings and how to do these starts. But it's really valuable to look back at some of these this drawing instruction from the early 19 to mid 1900s in particular, where really everybody was being taught drawing in a more comprehensive way than we are currently, and bringing some of those techniques and skills into 2022, and putting them to use for the things that we want to draw. All right, I think that boom, right at noon. I love it when I do that. I tell you, I don't practice that, but it's wonderful when it works. Thank you, folks, so much for being here today for another summer of drawing. Next week, we'll be moving into some toned paper. So if you can have on hand gray, blue, green, mid-tone papers, I guess the same variety of pencils, but also bringing in, maybe some of the other ones that you have on hand, your mechanical pencil and that sort of thing. And then a white of some sort, a white charcoal pencil, a white colored pencil, a white chalk or something, even white gouache if you don't have any white pencils on hand, or a white watercolor. The reason we want the white is because when you're working with toned paper, you get to eliminate all those midtones and you deal only with the darks and the lights. So that will be what we'll be working on next week. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful week. I hope you have fun drawing the robin, and get in touch with me if there's anything that drives you crazy, and we'll see what I end up doing with those bricks.